Microaggressions, we're finally getting to microaggressions, but I mention all these things because I think it's important for us to put into context the systems and the institutions and the history that leads us to where we are in terms of our interpersonal interactions with each other. That if we belong to a system that isn't even protecting against LGBTQ people, then perhaps microaggressions are going to continue to exist because our system doesn't protect us in itself. But I know that people here know about microaggressions, so let's briefly go through some of the definitions. Microaggressions are defined as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed groups. Now let's break this down. So they're brief and commonplace, meaning that some microaggressions can last up to 5 seconds. You know, somebody says something homophobic, that was 5 seconds, all 5 seconds that it took them to say that. Somebody looks at a same-sex couple and discuss as they hold hands. That's a very brief encounter that that a person may have experienced. They're also commonplace. In a lot of our research, people of various groups talk about the microaggressions that they experience on a daily basis. Sometimes people might experience several microaggressions a day. Sometimes people might experience the same microaggression multiple times a day or a week. But again, these are commonplace experiences that people might encounter. They're verbal, behavioral, and environmental, meaning that they could take different forms. They could be statements. They could be behaviors, how people act around you, the different looks that people give you, the different ways that people's body language communicates how they feel or stereotype you. Sometimes even just the environment itself can be microaggressive. I know a lot of times on college campuses, just being around buildings that are named after old white heterosexual men can feel microaggressive. Why aren't there a lot of buildings that are named after people of color or women or LGBTQ people? Microaggressions are intentional or unintentional. Sometimes they're intentional, where the person meant to say something or they were aware that they said something, but they didn't necessarily know that it was going to hurt your feelings. They didn't necessarily see anything wrong with it. So for example, in a classroom setting, somebody might be trying to make a point where they're debating with you, they're arguing some sort of issue, and in doing so that they may have said something that was completely stereotypical or hurtful or offensive, and so they intended to say something, they didn't realize the impact that it would have. Sometimes they're completely unintentional and unconscious, where a person didn't even realize that they made that face when you walked by them. People didn't even realize that they had said something to you that you viewed as being offensive. People didn't even recognize that they even did that, and they needed somebody else to point that out to them. A lot of times people don't even know what their behavior is until somebody else points it out to them. And so we realize that because of that, it makes it hard to discuss microaggressions, because if you didn't even realize that you did anything, then that might be difficult for you to hear. And then the whole point of microaggressions is that they communicate these hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed groups. What we're finding is that this definition of microaggression is working and it's developing. We're saying that people of all groups actually can experience microaggressions, but perhaps microaggressions are felt most by people from historically marginalized or oppressed groups. So what I mean is that people might be able to microaggress against men or against white people or against heterosexual people, but what our research is finding is that even if those groups do experience microaggressions, that they might not have the same negative reaction that people of color, women, LGBTQ people have, for people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups might have. Microaggressions was originally derived from some of the research on racial microaggressions. Racial microaggressions was actually first talked about in the 1970s by an American psychiatrist named Chester Pierce. However, the research didn't really pick up, and people didn't really talk about microaggressions until 2007, when Daryl McSue and his colleagues, including myself, started to revisit microaggressions. And if you think about what was happening during that time, it was when President Obama was running for office, and in the primaries he was running against Hillary Clinton, and so there were a lot of subtle and not so subtle racial and sexist things that were being said in the media and even in just people's everyday lives that may have been more microaggressive in that they were well-intentioned and not malicious, but perhaps conveyed or communicated people's negative stereotypes or biases. The dilemmas with microaggressions, and again, I'm sure that you know about some of this stuff, but microaggressions are difficult to talk about, and they're difficult to identify because of these factors. One is that there's the clash of realities. Two people can view the same instance as being two, and come up with two completely different meanings or interpretations of what may have happened. So a person may say something that the recipient of the microaggression views as offensive, and the other person views as free speech. And so there's a clash of realities. Well, I feel like I could say this because I have a right to say this, and the other person says, well, it hurts me, and so you're not understanding that this hurts me, so why are you saying this? So there's a clash of people's realities. Perhaps this clash of realities is due to people's different worldviews. If you belong to a group that historically has been marginalized, where in your own personal story you have been victim of microaggressions and discrimination throughout your lifetime, perhaps you might be more sensitive to some certain things. Perhaps you might be more aware of certain things that are hurtful. And because of that, your worldview is to pick up on these microaggressions, to react to these microaggressions, versus a person whose worldview involves privilege, or where they haven't experienced as much discrimination, or where they don't know what people of various marginalized groups go through, that they might be okay, or they might not necessarily be able to admit to microaggressions, and oftentimes become defensive when talking about microaggressions. There's also the perceived minimal harm of microaggressions. And basically what this means is that a lot of times people will say that, you know, it's just microaggression, just get over it. It was quick. Who cares if somebody said that to you? Stop being so sensitive. Stop being so paranoid. The world isn't out to get you. So people will say these things. However, what our research is finding, and this has been found in several studies from people from all over the country, is that people who experience microaggressions actually experience several mental health issues, actually report different depressive symptoms, and more recently even report physical health symptoms. And so what we're seeing is that microaggressions actually are harmful and do have a negative impact on people's lives. And then the last piece about microaggressions is this whole idea of the catch-22 of responding to microaggressions. So when something overtly racist or sexist or heterosexist occurs, oftentimes people are able to say, yes, that was racist, that was sexist, that was heterosexist, and so they might be able to talk about it with a person or talk about it with peers. But oftentimes with microaggressions, they're so tricky because you don't know what a person's intentions were. You didn't know you might think that, like, oh, well, maybe it's not that bad. You might minimize what had just happened. And so as a result of that, sometimes people don't know whether to respond or not. In terms of LGBT microaggressions, which I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about different examples of microaggressions. And what I challenge you all to think about is just how you might be both a victim of microaggressions and how you also might be a perpetrator of microaggressions. I say this because even myself, as somebody who has studied microaggressions and talks about microaggressions, I'm aware that I commit microaggressions all the time. Not necessarily willingly or knowingly. Sometimes these need to be pointed out to me. But because of some of the privileged groups that I belong to, I might not recognize some of the things that I say and how that might be offensive or hurtful or convey subtle bias. So for example, as a man, there might be certain things that I miss and I don't recognize that I say that might come off as sexist or might offend women. As a gender-conforming person, I might say things that might convey some of the transphobic biases or the genderist biases that I might have. But I also know, as a person who belongs to various marginalized groups or historically marginalized groups, that I know that I have been the recipient or the victim of microaggressions as well. And so it's common for people to experience both types, and I think we need to recognize that everybody can commit them.